There are battles that merely decide the borders of a province, and then there are battles that expose the hidden exhaustion of an entire civilization. Yarmouk belongs to the second kind. In AD 636, the Eastern Roman Empire did not merely lose ground in Syria, it discovered a terrifying historical truth. It learned that prestige, overwhelming numbers, and ancient institutions could catastrophically fail before a younger power whose greatest weapon was not size, but absolute coherence. To understand the gravity of Yarmouk, the mind must begin far from the battlefield itself. The 6 days that shattered Byzantine control in the Near East were not an isolated military drama, nor were they a sudden miracle detached from the mechanics of history. They were the culmination of a deeper, apocalyptic unraveling across late antiquity, where the two great superpowers of the age had spent generations bleeding one another in contests so vast that victory itself became a form of slow suicide. For nearly 3 decades, between AD 602 and 628, the Eastern Roman Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire had waged a war of unprecedented annihilation. They had built their identities around endurance, hierarchy, and imperial grandeur. But by the early 7th century, both had become trapped inside a lethal, inescapable logic. Each new campaign required one more mobilization, one more crushing tax burden, one more gamble, one more strain placed upon a peasantry already stretched beyond the limits of human endurance. Empires frequently imagine that survival is the ultimate proof of their strength. More often, survival merely postpones the accounting. Few episodes in the human record reveal this tragic paradox better than the reign of the Byzantine Emperor Heraclius. When he seized power in AD 610, the Roman world was in a state of collapse so severe that its total extinction seemed inevitable. Sasanian Persian armies had surged through Roman territory with devastating, irreversible success. Antioch fell. Jerusalem was sacked in AD 614, and the true cross was carried away. Egypt, the undisputed breadbasket of the empire and the foundation of its wealth, was severed from Constantinople. The old Roman prestige, that magnificent aura of inevitability constructed over a millennium, looked suddenly violently brittle. But Heraclius was no passive inheritor of decline. He engineered one of antiquity's most astonishing recoveries. Melting down the gold and silver of the churches, he reorganized the empire's entire military apparatus, rallied resources that barely existed, and carried a holy war deep into the heart of Persian space. Through sheer audacity, superhuman endurance, and strategic ingenuity, he broke the Sasanian state at Nineveh and reversed the tide of history. The long war ended with absolute Roman victory. Yet, that triumph concealed a terrible, invisible truth. The empire that emerged from that victory was not the empire that had entered the war. Heraclius had saved Rome, but he had saved a body already cut open and bled dry. The imperial finances were in total disorder. Generations of fighting men lay dead in the dust of Mesopotamia. The provinces of the Levant had been ravaged, traded back and forth between occupying armies. Administrative cohesion had frayed irreparably under the stress of a prolonged, existential emergency. The imperial state still possessed the outward trappings of power, the magnificent ceremonies, the imposing titles, the massive arsenals, and an astonishing institutional memory of greatness. But memory does not move grain. Memory does not heal demographic collapse. And memory does not erase the bitter resentment of local populations who had been taxed, conscripted, and fought over for decades. Heraclius had won the war against Persia, but he inherited the catastrophic punishment of winning it. This stands as one of history's cruelest, most consistent patterns. The statesman who miraculously rescues a system in one crisis almost always finds that the rescue itself has consumed the exact reserves needed to survive the next. Syria lay at the very center of this new, terrifying vulnerability. To the bureaucrats in Constantinople, Syria was not some peripheral, expendable borderland whose loss could be casually absorbed. Syria was an indispensable tax base, a massive recruiting region, a global commercial artery, a volatile religious crossroads, and the strategic shield of the Mediterranean core. It connected the empire's maritime world to the deep inland corridors of the Near East. It was also psychological terrain. To control Syria was to affirm that the emperor remained the master of the world. To lose it was to admit that the frontier was no longer a frontier at all, but a massive breach opening directly toward the empire's inner organs. Yet, while Rome emerged from one titanic geopolitical struggle utterly exhausted, another historical force was being rapidly assembled just beyond the edge of the imperial imagination. For centuries, Arabia had existed in Roman and Persian eyes merely as a vast, arid region of tribal politics, caravan trade networks, frontier diplomacy, and intermittent, localized military annoyance. But the rise of Islam transformed the Arabian Peninsula from a reservoir of fragmented, competing energies into a unified political and ideological engine of astonishing power. Following the Ridda Wars, what had previously been divided by fierce tribal rivalry was aggressively organized under a new, singular unity of belief, authority, and strategic purpose. This was not merely the birth of a religion. It was the rapid genesis of a state-forming force capable of directing massive manpower, unyielding loyalty, and highly coordinated military action across a staggering geographic horizon. That systemic transformation matters profoundly because aging empires consistently fail to recognize when the fundamental character of a neighboring region has changed. Rome knew exactly how to think about desert raids, tribal coalitions, buffer states, and the delicate art of negotiated frontier management. But a movement capable of consolidating the entirety of Arabian martial energy into sustained, multi-theater campaigns represented something else entirely. It brought not only highly motivated fighters, but a centralized command structure that seamlessly fused political expansion, spiritual confidence, and brilliant military adaptation. The result was an entirely new species of opponent, unencumbered by the sluggish routines of old statecraft, lean, highly mobile, and increasingly disciplined in its own ruthless methods. The Byzantine problem in the year 636, therefore, was not merely external. It was deeply, structurally internal. The empire's army in the east was formidable and massive on paper, but paper armies do not make decisions in the chaos of battle. Commanders do. Provincial elites do. Alienated religious communities do. And beneath the fragile veneer of imperial authority lay deep fault lines that decades of warfare had only widened. The eastern provinces were filled with populations deeply alienated by complex theological disputes with Constantinople. The imperial center brutally enforced Chalcedonian orthodoxy, treating local Miaphysite beliefs not as differing interpretations, but as treasonous disruptions of public order. In times of peace and supreme confidence, massive empires can survive such internal divisions. In times of crisis, every unresolved cultural argument becomes a fatal strategic weakness. The massive Byzantine army itself perfectly reflected this immense structural strain. It was multinational, multilayered, and dangerously dependent upon commanders who loathed one another and rarely shared identical priorities. Diversity in an army is not inherently a flaw, The Roman state had spent 1,000 years excelling at turning varied peoples into a single, terrifying military machine. But that kind of integration requires absolute trust, rigorous discipline, and a perfectly clear chain of operational confidence. When authority is respected only formally, and not instinctively, a massive army quickly ceases to be a weapon. It becomes a massive, lumbering negotiation in armor. This was the central, defining tension before the Battle of Yarmouk. On one side stood a colossal empire possessing rich institutions, infinite prestige, brilliant engineers of war, and an ancient, ossified habit of command. On the other stood a rising, highly mobile coalition animated by a ferocious unity of mission, vastly superior operational flexibility, and the lethal advantage that always belongs to ascending powers. Brutal necessity had made it decisive, fast, and completely intolerant of delay. One side possessed overwhelming scale. The other possessed absolute cohesion. History repeatedly, mercilessly demonstrates that when these two qualities collide on a battlefield, the outcome depends not on which army looks more magnificent from a distance, but on which system can survive confusion at the decisive, bloody hour. Emperor Heraclius clearly understood the massive scale of the threat, even if its true, world-altering dimensions were still obscured by the dense fog of war. He was no complacent, silken monarch hiding behind palace walls. He had already proven his supreme capacity for strategic reinvention by annihilating the Persian threat. But statesmen are trapped by the cruel timing of history as much as by their own talent. The fierce, boundless energy that had once made Heraclius the savior of Rome now confronted an entirely different political reality. Yesterday's brilliant architect of recovery had slowly become the exhausted, deteriorating manager of a hopelessly strained inheritance. This is among history's most tragic ironies. A leader may clearly see the approaching storm, fully understand its devastating potential, and still completely lack the institutional reserves required to survive it. The Byzantine strategic dilemma in Syria was agonizing. If Imperial forces remained dispersed in garrisons across the Levant, they risked being isolated, besieged, and defeated in parts by a highly mobile Arab enemy perfectly skilled at exploiting local weakness. But if the Romans concentrated into a single, overwhelming field army, they created a completely different, equally lethal danger. Highly cumbersome command, desperately slow reaction times, agonizing logistical nightmares, and constant, bitter friction among competing generals. To defend everything with scattered forces was to invite a slow, piecemeal destruction. To risk everything on one massive concentration was to place extraordinary, unendurable pressure on military coordination. Driven by the need for a decisive victory, the empire chose mass. A vast, multinational army of staggering proportions was painstakingly assembled, drawing together heavy Byzantine regular infantry, heavily armored cataphracts, Armenian contingents, Slavic auxiliaries, and thousands of Christian Arab allies under the Ghassanid banner. In pure military theory, this massive concentration offered exactly what an imperial apparatus is designed to offer: vastly superior numbers, deeply established military doctrine, and the sheer kinetic weight to crush a dangerous challenger in a single afternoon. But massive concentration solves one problem only by severely intensifying another. Every additional contingent brings thousands of swords, but it also brings massive egos, competing personalities, bitter rivalries, conflicting languages, and endless disputes about prestige and precedence. Who commands the vanguard at the decisive moment? Whose tactical doctrine governs the engagement? How aggressively should a highly mobile enemy be pursued if that enemy simply refuses to stand and fight where the Romans expect them to? What appears as terrifying mass from a distance often feels like paralyzing argument from within. Across the sun-baked field of history stands the figure of Khalid ibn al-Walid, a commander whose name later memory would rightfully elevate into legend. But myth often obscures as much as it reveals. The true historical significance of Khalid lies not merely in his personal, fearless bravery or his undeniable battlefield charisma. It lies in his supreme, cold operational intelligence. Khalid understood tempo. He understood that mobility is not simply moving fast. It is the cognitive ability to make rapid, decisive choices faster than a heavy opponent can organize a counter-response. He understood that the morale of fighting men is uniquely preserved when troops instinctively believe their command structure knows exactly what it is doing. Above all, Khalid understood that against a vastly larger, heavily armored imperial force, the most decisive resource was not raw aggression, but highly disciplined, ruthless flexibility. The Rashidun strategic decision in the days leading up to Yarmouk was therefore not an act of reckless, zealot audacity. It was a masterpiece of deliberate, calculated concentration designed specifically to avoid being caught and destroyed in isolated fragments. As the massive Byzantine army lumbered south, the Muslim forces scattered across Syria executed a brilliant, coordinated withdrawal, abandoning captured cities and consolidating their strength on the vast, rugged plateau near the Yarmouk River. To the untrained, arrogant eyes of some Roman generals, such a massive withdrawal closely resembled a panicked retreat born of weakness and fear. In cold strategic reality, it was a flat refusal to fight the war on imperial terms. Khalid's primary aim was to force an apocalyptic battle in a very specific geographic theater, a landscape of deep ravines and restrictive plains where Byzantine numerical superiority would be incredibly difficult to translate into a clean, wide envelopment, all while preserving an absolutely unified Arab command capable of instant, devastating adaptation. This subtle distinction matters profoundly. Great, established powers consistently assume that smaller, rising opponents are simply desperately trying to survive. But the most lethal smaller opponents are not trying to survive. They are meticulously trying to shape the physical and psychological field of decision itself. The Rashidun command did not need to match the Roman institutions in bureaucratic breadth. It only needed to ensure that when the massive clash finally came, the Byzantines would face not scattered, disorganized desert raiders, but a highly concentrated, lethal striking force operating under a single, coherent direction. In the brutal mathematics of warfare, the side that forces the enemy to fight under the greatest systemic strain often wins the battle long before the first line of infantry clashes. The fog of war heavily thickened every calculation. The Byzantine supreme commanders, men like Vahan and Tritherius, were forced to interpret an enemy that absolutely refused to behave according to familiar, centuries-old frontier patterns. Was this highly mobile Arab force meant to be pinned quickly against the ravines and crushed? Or was extreme caution required to preserve defensive order among the wildly diverse imperial contingents? How much initiative should local subcommanders be allowed to exercise, and how much had to be rigidly subordinated to the centralized Roman direction? Such complex questions are never merely abstract academic debates. They become deadly, bleeding realities when tens of thousands of men are maneuvering in the dust, when water and supplies are finite, and when every hour of paralyzing delay silently erodes the confidence of the rank and file. The hidden, grinding mechanics of the campaign are far too easy to overlook because popular history consistently privileges cinematic spectacle over structural analysis. Yet the cataclysm at Yarmouk was being irrevocably shaped by supply trains, communication lines, command friction, and psychological confidence long before the most famous cavalry maneuvers ever unfolded. The Arab forces operated intimately near a highly coherent, absolutely singular command purpose. That cohesion did not magically remove the horrific hardship, the staggering danger, or the very real human fear of facing the Roman heavy infantry. But it did mean that immediate action and strategic intention aligned perfectly, without bureaucratic friction. The vast Byzantine army, by harsh contrast, possessed incredible formal authority but agonizingly thin trust across its many layers. Imperial orders can move swiftly through a military hierarchy, but absolute confidence cannot be commanded by an emperor's decree. Thus, Yarmouk rapidly escalated into something far greater than a mere struggle for the province of Syria. It became a spectacular, violent collision between two completely different civilizational energies. The Byzantine army represented imperial restoration. It was the desperate effort of an ancient, severely traumatized state to rigidly reassert order after barely surviving a colossal, generational war. The Rashidun army represented revolutionary consolidation. It was the brilliant effort of a rising, dynamic polity to permanently convert its new, radical unity into irreversible strategic transformation. One side fought fiercely to retain a dying world. The other fought flawlessly to build a new one. When these two massive hosts finally confronted one another near the deep gorges of the Yarmouk River in the late summer of AD 636, the harsh geography mattered immensely because it imposed absolute, lethal consequences on any loss of organizational disorder. The incredibly difficult terrain, bounded by steep ravines and severely constrained avenues of retreat, would act as a massive amplifier for whichever side lost its tactical coherence first. In such unforgiving settings, total victory is rarely achieved by one dramatic, cinematic blow at the start of the battle. Instead, complex military systems are battered and tested repeatedly, day after day, until one apparatus can no longer recover from the accumulating stress. The opening days of the battle unfolded as a grueling, bloody contest of massive pressure. The Romans systematically sought to use their superior numbers, their heavy armor, and their disciplined infantry blocks to batter, aggressively stretch, and ultimately shatter the Muslim lines. This was a perfectly rational, highly established imperial approach. A vastly larger army should theoretically force a constant, exhausting defensive reaction, rapidly exploit weak points in the enemy formation, and eventually make continued resistance impossible. But this brutal logic absolutely depended upon the massive imperial host acting as one single, perfectly integrated instrument. Each massive Roman offensive had to seamlessly reinforce the next. Kinetic momentum had to steadily accumulate. The smaller Arab force had to be ruthlessly denied any time to rest or reset. The Rashidun command, however, did not aim at theatrical heroics. They aimed at highly calculated endurance with a lethal purpose. The Arab infantry lines had to absorb horrific punishment, bend backwards under the immense weight of the Roman advance, rapidly reposition, and simply survive until the clumsy Byzantine coordination inevitably began to fray under the immense psychological burden of repeated, failed effort. This was the true underlying question of the battle. Could a smaller, lighter army withstand repeated, devastating blows from heavy infantry without permanently losing its nerve? And could a massive, ponderous army composed of deeply suspicious contingents maintain its fragile unity long enough to convert its numerical advantage into a decisive, shattering collapse? This dynamic is precisely what made the 6 days of Yarmouk a supreme test of institutional systems under extreme pressure. Not all great armies fail at the terrifying moment of first contact. Many fail days later, after massive effort has been violently spent but the strategic results remain agonizingly incomplete. Men can endure staggering danger if they firmly believe that progress is occurring. But repeated, massive frontal assaults that result in massive casualties without irreversible success breed a highly contagious doubt. Doubt rapidly corrodes timing. Corroded timing completely ruins tactical coordination. And once coordination slips in a massive formation, numerical superiority instantly ceases to be a terrifying advantage and becomes a lethal, crushing burden. Khalid's brilliant battlefield method was built precisely around exploiting this psychological reality. His tactical decision-making was highly centralized to maintain absolute defensive cohesion, but his mobile cavalry reserve was kept highly fluid, ready to be redeployed at lightning speed to reinforce any sector bending under Byzantine pressure, or to aggressively exploit brief, local Roman openings. This incredible capacity for rapid tempo control mattered immensely. In ancient and late antique warfare, mobile reserves are not simply spare men waiting in the rear. They are the fragile difference between holding the line and suffering total collapse. They are the sole barrier between a localized tactical setback and a massive strategic disaster. Khalid utilized his cavalry not merely as a blunt hammer, but as a precise instrument of psychological tempo control. A threatened infantry point could be stabilized instantly. A hard-won Byzantine gain could be violently denied the critical time needed to become a breakthrough. A brief, favorable moment could be violently expanded into a crisis before the heavy Roman commanders could even issue an adjustment. The sheer genius here was immaculate timing, not mindless, fanatic aggression. Later Romantic memory often incorrectly celebrates great commanders by reducing them to mere symbols of fearless attack. But fearless attack without supreme judgment is only massive waste. Khalid's real, historic strength was his ability to read the violent rhythm of the battle vastly more clearly than the divided men leading the Roman army. He inherently knew exactly when to absorb a blow, when to aggressively reinforce, when to threaten a flank, and exactly when to miraculously convert defensive resilience into overwhelming offensive pressure. The relentless Byzantine offensives, meanwhile, clearly revealed the horrific tragedy of massive weight without fluid unity. There were multiple moments of severe, near-fatal pressure on the Muslim lines. Arab camps were breached. The battle was wildly contested, unspeakably violent, and deeply uncertain. But despite their terrifying mass, repeated imperial attacks consistently failed to produce the one thing required: an irreversible, shattering collapse of the Rashidun army. That repeated operational failure mattered infinitely more than any isolated, temporary Roman success. Every major imperial push that failed to completely shatter the opposing army consumed immense Byzantine physical strength, while simultaneously teaching the smaller Arab force that absolute survival was entirely possible. This is precisely where the dark science of mass psychology enters military history with full, devastating force. Great armies do not fight solely with steel weapons, armor, and rigid formations. They fight with interpretation and expectation. If a massive imperial army entirely expects to crush a smaller enemy and repeatedly fails to do so, the expectation itself becomes a highly dangerous vulnerability. Imperial confidence turns incredibly brittle. Heavy commanders begin to desperately fear that the window of opportunity is permanently slipping. Bitter subordinates begin to loudly wonder whether their neighboring contingents are cowardly failing to do their part. Every minor delay acquires a massive, terrifying moral weight. What should have been one terrifying Roman machine rapidly degrades into a massive, suspicious collection of anxieties simply standing near one another on the sand. By the later, critical phases of the Six-Day Struggle, the deeper institutional asymmetry finally began to reveal itself. The Muslim army, though battered, bleeding, and under extreme physical strain, was still operating seamlessly inside a highly coherent pattern of instant command response. The Byzantine army, though still massively formidable, was paying exponentially increasing cognitive costs for its internal friction. It is one of the iron, unforgiving laws of warfare that bureaucratic friction punishes the vastly larger force much more severely once offensive momentum permanently slips. A small, highly unified army can rapidly recover its balance through quick, informal consensus. A massive, multi-ethnic imperial army must attempt to recover through agonizing, system-wide alignment across multiple languages and hostile generals. That is a functionally impossible demand in the blinding dust and terror of a battlefield crisis. The ultimate catastrophic turning point arrived when brilliant Arab cavalry action and perfectly coordinated pressure fundamentally transformed the strategic logic of the battlefield. What had been a desperate Arab struggle to withstand massive imperial assaults suddenly became a terrifying Roman contest over retreat, desperate repositioning, and sheer survival. Once Khalid's highly mobile forces captured the vital bridge at Ain al-Dakhar, severing the primary Roman escape route, and began striking at vulnerable flanks, Byzantine confidence no longer rested upon the glorious expectation of victory. It rested entirely upon the desperate, fragile hope of an orderly withdrawal. That is the exact psychological threshold at which mere defeats instantly mutate into civilizational catastrophes. Strategic retreat in itself is not inherently a defeat. Many great armies have withdrawn in good order and lived to fight another campaign. But a retreat ceases to be a military operation the exact moment that men begin to deeply suspect that order can no longer be restored. At Yarmouk, once Roman cohesion began rapidly dissolving near the steep, unforgiving edges of the Wadi al-Ruqad ravines, the sheer scale of the Byzantine army spectacularly magnified the disaster. The very concentration of massive numbers that had been designed to deliver an overwhelming, crushing force now exponentially increased the deadly congestion, the blinding confusion, and the sheer velocity of the collapse. A magnificent force painstakingly assembled to crush the enemy became lethally trapped by the terrifying consequences of its own unwieldiness. Thousands of armored men, blinded by dust storms and panic, were pushed by the sheer weight of their own retreating comrades into the deep gorges below. This horrific spectacle was institutional failure made brutally, physically visible. The battle did not end merely because men finally lost the courage to swing their swords. It ended because the deeply flawed bureaucratic structures meant to keep a massive imperial army functioning under supreme stress completely snapped. Tactical coordination violently failed long before personal courage vanished. Institutional trust collapsed long before imperial manpower was fully exhausted. And once that invisible architecture of trust completely fell apart, massive numbers no longer represented imperial strength. They only represented the staggering, apocalyptic scale of the ruin. By the close of the 6 bloody days, the strategic meaning of the silence on the plateau was utterly unmistakable. Syria was no longer securely Roman in any meaningful, enforceable sense. A massive clash of arms had become a final, devastating verdict on the empire's capacity to maintain its ancient dominance after the exhaustion of the Persian War. This does not mean the Byzantine state instantly ceased to exist or matter. Far from it. The Roman Empire in the East would fiercely endure for centuries more, constantly adapting, fighting, and remaining one of history's most brilliant, resilient states. But the slaughter at Yarmouk permanently marked the death of one specific grandiose possibility: the absolute restoration of Roman supremacy across the entire Near East based on the old, unchallenged assumptions of power. The direct geopolitical consequences were staggering and immediate. With the intricate shield of Syria permanently shattered, the grand path opened toward vastly deeper Muslim expansion into the Levant, Egypt, and far beyond. The Byzantine strategic posture was violently forced to change overnight from an arrogant posture of offensive restoration to one of desperate, grinding defensive preservation. The great city of Constantinople remained wealthy, incredibly sophisticated, and highly dangerous behind its massive walls. But its worldview permanently narrowed. The Roman state now had to think vastly less in terms of ruling a universal world, and entirely in terms of holding together a besieged, defensible core. For the young, rising caliphate, the historical consequences were equally profound, but in the exact opposite direction. The absolute triumph at Yarmouk did not merely provide the Arabs with rich, new territory. It permanently validated their centralized political authority. It wildly intensified mass recruitment across the peninsula. It irreversibly converted a passionate religious unity into a durable, terrifying imperial confidence. Military victories of this unprecedented scale do far more than just enrich a state's treasury. They fundamentally teach a rising people exactly what they might become. A unified movement that had only recently consolidated the tribal energies of Arabia was now physically proving itself capable of completely dismantling one of the greatest, most heavily armored military traditions of the ancient world. Such undeniable proof permanently alters the psychological calculations of allies, terrified rivals, wavering subjects, and ambitious commanders alike. Momentum in human history is not some mystical, invisible force. It is simply the rapidly widening, undeniable effect of unprecedented success upon human expectation. The provincial, civilian dimension of this massive transition must also be faced with absolute clarity. Great empires are sustained over centuries not only by the brutal force of their armies, but by the quiet willingness of local societies to remain functionally invested in imperial rule. When that civic investment thins out, military conquest rapidly accelerates. The Byzantine state had long governed the incredibly diverse Levant through sophisticated bureaucratic administration and the heavy weight of inherited legitimacy. But legitimacy is never a permanent relic preserved forever simply by past achievements. It is an incredibly fragile relationship, constantly renewed or severely weakened by shifting policy, heavy taxation, arrogant religious handling, physical security, and mutual trust. In regions where Roman imperial authority had grown to appear distant, highly contested, or theologically oppressive, local resistance to the new Arab rulers proved to be vastly less cohesive than old imperial ideology arrogantly assumed it would be. This incredibly complex reality does not lazily reduce Yarmouk to a simple, romantic tale of provincial liberation or anti-Roman resentment. Human history is rarely so clean or morally convenient. The deeply fractured provincial populations contained vastly mixed interests, complex loyalties, intense fears, and pragmatic survival calculations. But the broader, unforgiving historical law stands absolute. No empire, no matter how grand its titles or architecture, can rely indefinitely on sheer military power alone if the complex social and spiritual fabric beneath its rule has fundamentally frayed. Armies can hold frontiers for a time, but only shared belief can hold an empire. The profound, overarching lesson of Yarmouk, then, is not that the Byzantine Empire was a fragile, decadent caricature simply waiting to be effortlessly swept away by desert warriors. That highly flawed interpretation flatters easy, dramatic storytelling and completely obscures the much harder, more terrifying truth. The Romans lost Syria because even the most highly sophisticated, deeply institutionalized states on Earth can be utterly broken by the quiet accumulation of systemic strain, massive bureaucratic mistrust, deep logistical fatigue, and the fatal inability to convert immense resources into highly coherent action at the decisive moment. This is vastly more unsettling than a simple moral tale of imperial decadence. It means that highly capable, massive systems can fail entirely, not from theatrical, obvious corruption, but from a profound exhaustion utterly hidden beneath a facade of continued, majestic grandeur. They look terrifyingly formidable right up until the exact moment they suddenly cannot perform the one critical task that history absolutely demands of them. The brutal reality of leadership under severe systemic stress is equally merciless. Emperor Heraclius and his squabbling commanders faced administrative and military burdens that were, in many fundamental respects, entirely impossible to carry. They inherited an empire massively wounded by its own previous victory, severely divided internally, and completely confronted by an unprecedented adversary whose rise was vastly swifter than any established imperial analysis had fully absorbed. Yet, history does not grade leaders on a curve of sympathy. Ancient prestige offers absolutely no exemption from the violent consequences of reality. A state may have highly valid, perfectly rational reasons for its temporary weakness. Its enemies do not care. They need only aggressively exploit them. This is precisely why the memory of Yarmouk still matters today, echoing across the centuries. It reveals, with terrifying clarity, exactly how rapidly the massive architecture of global power can collapse once absolute belief, brilliant organization, and historic opportunity perfectly align against it. The decisive, world-altering contest on that dusty plateau was not simply a battle of Roman versus Arab, nor was it merely the old, established faith fighting against the dynamic new one. It was the timeless clash of massive scale against lethal cohesion, of burdened inheritance against absolute purpose, of exhausted, cynical order against rising, unstoppable conviction. In every single age of human affairs, massive institutions comfortably assume that their accumulated, immense structure naturally guarantees their survival. But massive structure without deep, unifying trust rapidly becomes an unendurable weight. Immense scale without lightning-fast coordination rapidly becomes a brittle, shattered liability. And historical prestige, without the ruthless willingness to adapt, simply becomes a highly elegant obituary waiting patiently to be written. The final verdict of history is severe, and it is absolute. Yarmouk was the apocalyptic crucible in which the Eastern Roman Empire paid the ultimate, permanent strategic price of extreme imperial overstretch after decades of total, exhausting war. The rich province of Syria was lost not because Rome had somehow miraculously forgotten how to forge armor or swing a sword, but because its immense strength could no longer be effectively concentrated without completely exposing the deep, fatal fractures lying just beneath it. The stunning Rashidun victory was not some random accident of raw religious enthusiasm. It was the absolute, undeniable triumph of highly unified command, supreme operational agility, and terrifying political momentum over a vastly larger, heavily armored, but fundamentally fatigued imperial machine. The agonizing physical cost of the battle was counted in tens of thousands of dead soldiers, completely shattered legions, permanently abandoned provinces, and a violent, permanent alteration of the entire global balance of power. But the deepest, most devastating cost was entirely psychological. Rome woke up and discovered that mere survival against one great enemy had not preserved the old world order. It had merely delayed, for a few brief years, the violent arrival of a completely new one. The modern mirror reflected in the dust of Yarmouk is entirely impossible to ignore. Massive, powerful states in every single era of human history consistently mistake immense capacity on paper for lethal capacity in action. They carefully count their bloated budgets, their massive personnel rosters, and their vast territorial influence, but they consistently, fatally underestimate the slow creep of systemic fatigue, the paralysis of internal factionalism, and the silent, deadly corrosion of their own institutional legitimacy. They arrogantly assume that because their ancient institutions still cast a long shadow, those institutions still command the instinctive, absolute trust of the people and the soldiers. But complex systems usually break only after a long, quiet period in which glaring warning signs are comfortably reinterpreted by bureaucrats as mere temporary disruptions. The profound lesson of Yarmouk is not confined to ancient, blood-soaked battlefields. It applies ruthlessly wherever massive organizations confuse accumulated size with living, breathing coherence. It applies wherever leaders invoke past, legendary victories as a comfortable substitute for present, ruthless adaptation. And it applies wherever rising, hungry challengers understand the supreme value of speed, total unity, and absolute purpose vastly better than the complacent incumbents do. The ultimate legacy question remains forever suspended over the ruins of empires. When a massive ancient order inevitably collapses before a smaller, highly dynamic newer force, what truly decides the final outcome? Sheer material strength, absolute moral confidence, or the profound ability to persuade human beings that their ultimate sacrifice still serves a meaningful, shared future? History offers us no comforting, easy answers. But the bones buried at Yarmouk suggest one incredibly hard, terrifying truth above all others. Great civilizations rarely fall the exact moment they become physically weak. They fall the moment they can no longer successfully turn massive power into highly coordinated belief. And once that critical, invisible conversion completely fails, the 6 days that violently change the world are never, ever far away.